Sony's creatively named follow-up to the PlayStation 3, the PlayStation 4, started life in 2008, still relatively early in the PS3's life cycle. Several major changes were decided on to differentiate it from the PS3. The first of these, and possibly the most significant, is the move from the cell processor used previously to a more traditional x86 AMD solution. This would bring the system in line with what other developers such as Microsoft were doing, along with being the architecture for PCs. This would lead into the second change Sony had in mind for the PS4. They wanted the console to be developer-friendly, taking the console's game development in a direction similar to that of the PS1 a decade earlier. The move to an x86 AMD APU effectively unified all the major console platforms and PCs on the same architecture, theoretically streamlining multi-platform development again. Blu-ray was once again the medium of choice for games, proving during the 7th console generation that it was by far the superior format on offer. It continued to provide excellent levels of storage for developers to produce some of the largest, most detailed games ever seen. CDs, however, were no longer to be supported by the PS4, due to the required laser not being a part of the system. As such, some of the multimedia features of the previous generation were lost, at least in their previous form anyway. Streaming was massively expanded on compared to what was started on with the PS3, and this served to fill in some of the gaps. During the console's development, Sony worked with Bungie, creators of the Halo and Destiny series, in order to better develop the console for first-person shooters. Specifically, they gave input that helped to develop the controller that the new console would use, the DualShock 4. The new controller, while still similar to previous iterations, featured several new features not present on older models. The most obvious new feature was that of a large touchpad. Sitting front and centre just above the thumbsticks, it could detect up to 2 simultaneous inputs as well as being pressed as a button, in much the same way a laptop trackpad works. Additionally, a speaker and LED light strip was added, which could be used in various ways within a game. The PS4 was the first Sony console since the PS2 that was designed with no backwards compatibility in mind. Presumably, compatibility with PS3 games being missing was down to the complex nature of the cell microprocessor that the console had used, meaning that a hardware-based solution would likely be expensive to implement. Despite the hardware of the PS4 being far more advanced, PS3 emulation was still somewhat lacking around that time. That isn't to say that Sony couldn't have made it work on the hardware of the PS4, they just chose not to. Again, the cost of developing a software-based emulation method for the PS4 was quite possibly the reason why it was never implemented. This is all quite reasonable. The PS3 was a notoriously difficult console to develop for. Emulation of it has only really started to make significant progress in the last few years. However, what many people felt to be unreasonable was the lack of support for PS1 and 2 titles. The removal of CD support was probably a factor in the decision. All PS1 games and some PS2 games were on CDs, meaning that they'd instantly be unplayable, and making the library available digitally would be a licensing nightmare. Still, it was disappointing. Some PS2 games were made available digitally through emulation later on in the console's life, but it was a relatively low number compared to the enormous library that was potentially available. The PlayStation 4 was officially announced at an event called PlayStation Meeting on February 20th, 2013 in New York City. At the show, details about the new console were revealed, the DualShock 4 was introduced to the public for the first time, and a whole host of new games were shown off. It wasn't until E3 a few months later that the console itself was shown, along with the price of release. A competitive $400, once again coming in significantly lower than the competition, with Microsoft's follow-up to the Xbox 360 retailing at $500 at launch. Sony's E3 showing that year was perhaps their most convincing ever. It may not have had the mimetic value of the PS1 price reveal, but in terms of humiliating the competition, it wasn't far off. Microsoft had a rough time of it at E3, announcing bad decision after bad decision live on stage, all of which further increased the good publicity that Sony and the PS4 were getting. The console's release date was announced at Gamescom later that year, with a November launch in North America and PAL territories, and February the following year in Japan. A decent selection of 21 titles were available at launch. Big hitters such as Assassin's Creed 4, Call of Duty Ghosts and Battlefield 4 all sold well, as well as the usual selection of sports games such as FIFA and Madden. Most of these were cross-generation titles, being released on the PS3 and Xbox 360, but taking advantage of the newer, more powerful hardware on PS4. PS4 sold exceptionally well upon release, taking over 1 million pre-orders by August of 2013. 250,000 consoles were sold in the UK in the first 48 hours, and over 2 million were sold worldwide by the start of the following month. In much the same way that the PS3 had multiple console iterations over its lifespan, the PS4 had several iterations of models too. The first of these was the Slim, released in September of 2016. As the name suggests, it was a smaller, sleekly designed console that eventually phased out the launch model. Internally, it was largely the same as the original launch model. It still had the same processing power and graphical capabilities. Aside from being 40% smaller than the original, the only real difference was the upgrade of the USB ports to the newer 3.1 standard. The Slim launched with the same 500GB hard drive of the original model, however only 6 months later, Sony announced that all Slim models would have a 1TB hard drive moving forward. This effectively doubled the amount of storage the console had available, while maintaining the same price point. Announced at the same time as the Slim was the second new revision of the PS4, the PS4 Pro. Releasing 2 months later in November of 2016, the Pro was a massively upgraded console that promised hardware powerful enough to enable 4K gaming, as well as general performance increases across the board. Many games moving forward had special features that took advantage of the Pro's increased power, with some older titles receiving patches in order to make use of the newer hardware. The Pro launched at $400 and ran alongside the Slim until it was discontinued in 2021. VR as a concept had started to gain traction throughout the 2010s. The barrier to entry, however, was quite high during this time. Generally, a high-end PC was required, along with the headset itself, neither of which tended to be cheap, meaning that VR was out of reach for many people who were unable or unwilling to spend the money in order to experience it. Sony decided to challenge this notion and set out to bring a relatively affordable VR experience to console gamers around the world. Codenamed Project Morpheus, PlayStation VR, or PSVR as it would be known as, was announced to the world at GDC in 2014. A prototype was shown off at GDC the following year. It featured a 1080p display, split between both eyes individually, and could render games up to 120Hz. Asynchronous projection was used to boost content that was only 60Hz to the 120Hz target in order to get the smoothest possible experience. This was incredibly important, as VR is particularly sensitive to low or inconsistent frame rates, often resulting in VR sickness when not met. VR sickness can manifest itself in several different ways, but often takes the form of nausea and headaches similar to motion or seasickness. As someone who took a while to get their VR legs, getting there was often quite unpleasant. A breakout box came bundled with the headset to connect it to the console. This sent the game's image to both the headset and the TV, allowing both the player and an audience to see what was going on in-game. PSVR released in October of 2016 at $400. A PlayStation camera was also required for the headset to work properly, the tracking relying on it to function. This bumped up the price of hardware by roughly another $50. PSVR made full use of the previously released PlayStation Move motion controllers, allowing for control methods other than a regular DualShock controller. PS Move controllers became somewhat rare and extremely sought after in the time after PSVR launched, with prices online reaching crazy levels, especially in the run up to Christmas, as the PSVR was one of the season's most sought after gadgets. Later in the console's life, several bundles were released that included both the camera and a selection of games, such as Resident Evil 7 and Skyrim VR. Ultimately, PSVR was still an expensive option, at least $400 on top of the price of a PS4, though this was still far cheaper than going down the PC VR route and required far less technical expertise to get it running. By the end of 2017, Sony announced that over 2 million units had been sold. It then went on to sell over 5 million units by the end of 2019, massively surpassing all expectations. Sony's online service, PlayStation Network, that was established for the previous generation's console, made a return with the PS4. It was more or less the same as that seen on PS3. PSN was largely a free service up to this point, allowing online play and messaging between users at no additional cost. A premium tier called PlayStation Plus was available for those who wanted it, offering up free games every month as well as cloud saves, automatically backing up a player's saves to an online server. Moving forward, the paid service, PlayStation Plus, was to be required for online play. Players could still access the store, play games and send messages on the free tier. However, online play, cloud storage for saves, and exclusive content was locked behind a paywall. This wasn't anything particularly new, with Microsoft using a similar system throughout the previous generation. New to the service though, was the ability to party up and chat as a group, something that was absent from the PS3. Initially, this allowed up to 8 people to get together and chat, regardless of what game they were playing, if they were playing any at all. This was a greatly welcomed feature, as the chat feature in some games could be a bit hit and miss in terms of quality. In 2019, Sony rolled out an update to the console that doubled the maximum party size to 16 players. Final Fantasy XIV came to the platform once again, making it the third generation in a row that a Square Enix cross-platform online RPG was released on Sony hardware. It received a full update to take advantage of the more powerful hardware that the PS4 offered, bringing it more in line with the PC version graphically. Aside from this, Sony initially took a firm stance on cross-platform play, something that was starting to become more common during this generation. Games like Minecraft, Fortnite and Apex Legends all eventually getting Sony to change their mind and bring it to the console, and as such now many games support it, allowing people to play together, often regardless of platform. The 2010s saw social media and its influence on our lives grow exponentially. Aside from actually playing the game yourself, YouTube and Twitch became the primary places to consume video game content. While the barrier to entry on these platforms isn't particularly high, especially these days, there is still a barrier. The PS4 aimed to lower that barrier. Specialised hardware in the console allowed for seamless video capture, with little to no performance hit, introduced in a similar manner to that of Shadowplay, introduced by Nvidia on their GTX graphics cards around the same time. This video could be shared directly to social media platforms such as YouTube, Twitter and Facebook. It could be transferred to a USB flash drive and moved over to PC for editing on traditional software. However, a free app came installed on the console called Share Factory. It allowed basic video editing, giving players some control over how their clips looked. All of this was accomplished by one button on the controller. The DualShock 4 did away with the select button that had been seen on all of the models before it, replacing it with the share button. Fully configurable, this one button could trigger the starting and stopping of the video recording, take screenshots and bring up options to share the media to other platforms. Streaming, which had grown massive in the years surrounding the PS4's launch, was also fully possible with no additional hardware, the share button triggering the start of the streaming session to either YouTube or Twitch. This even supported the PlayStation camera and the chat overlay so that the player could see any interaction without the need for another device to check the stream. The stream wasn't particularly customizable beyond the title, but it was a good start for those without the means of using a more traditional setup. Another interesting feature of the PS4's newfound social features was SharePlay, allowing a player to stream their game directly to somebody else via a party, and allowed them to take control of the game if they chose to. It was limited to only those with a PlayStation Plus subscription, and sessions were only available for an hour at a time, but there was no restriction on starting it up again immediately after it ended. I've never really been able to get it to work very well. Connection issues played one or both of us if it was attempted, but I know people who've made good use of it and have regularly shared games with each other this way. The PlayStation 4 was a huge critical and commercial success. As of March 2022, it has sold over 117 million units, which at the time of writing puts it in 4th place in overall console sales, only beaten by the Game Boy, Nintendo DS and PS2. It's in a strange place right now. The PS5 has been around for 2 years, but due to global pandemics, silicon shortages and scalpers, they've been pretty hard to get a hold of. Most games being released during this time are cross-generation titles, often having free or cheap upgrades from the base PS4 version to the PS5 version when a console becomes available. All this has ensured that the PS4 has continued to sell well, albeit just the slim model now due to the discontinuation of the Pro in 2021. In its 9-year life, it's largely dominated the competition, selling over double the units of the Xbox One and nearly 10 times that of the Wii U, though the Switch is rapidly catching up and will likely overtake it before long, despite being on the market for 4 years less. The 8th console generation introduced many new features to home consoles, a suite of social features, relatively affordable VR, and a new dawn of accessibility in games, with many games introducing better options for those with disabilities. It was a massive step up overall in terms of quality over the 7th generation. Performance was more often than not stable, if only at 30 frames per second in most cases, but that stability alone gave it a huge step forward compared to the previous era's consoles. Sony invested huge amounts of money in studios and series, leading to some of the best games in years and securing their reputation for having the best exclusives on consoles, thoroughly embarrassing their rivals and not for the first time. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please leave it a like and consider subscribing. What did you think of the PS4? What was your favourite game for it? Let me know down in the comments.